Agriculture currently consumes roughly 10 calories of fossil fuel energy for every single calorie of food that actually makes it onto a dinner plate. This staggering ratio highlights how deeply our food security is tied to industrial inputs, from the natural gas used in the Haber-Bosch process to produce nitrogen fertilizer, to the diesel powering massive machinery and global distribution networks. Permaculture was originally designed in the 1970s by Bill Mullinson and David Holmgren as a direct response to this vulnerability, specifically anticipating a future with less available energy. It's not just a gardening technique, it's a strategic framework for what Holmgren calls the energy descent, the inevitable transition away from high-energy industrialism toward more localized, biologically based systems.
That 10-to-1 ratio is the fundamental problem that permaculture aims to solve. When Mollison and Holmgren were observing the first major energy crises in the 1970s, they realized that modern agriculture isn't really a system of production, it's a system of transformation. It transforms fossil fuels into edible calories. In an energy-constrained future, that model simply breaks. Permaculture shifts the focus from being a dependent consumer to a responsible producer by mimicking natural ecosystems which, unlike industrial farms, require no external energy inputs to thrive. A forest doesn't need to be fertilized, irrigated, or sprayed with pesticides by a tractor, yet it builds soil and biomass year after year. The practical transition involves applying that logic to our own lives and farms.
It sounds like a radical shift in perspective, but how do we actually bridge the gap? Most people living in a typical suburban home or running a commercial farm can't just flip a switch and become a self-sustaining ecosystem. If we're looking at a future with less centralized power, what are the first tangible steps to decoupling from that grid?
The first step is always observation, which is the very first principle of permaculture. Observe and interact. Before buying a single solar panel or digging a swale, you have to understand the energy flows already moving through your site. Where does the sun hit in the winter? Which way does the wind blow? Where does water pool after a heavy rain? In a high-energy world, we use fossil fuels to override these natural patterns. We use air conditioning to fight the sun and pumps to move water uphill. In an energy-descent world, we use design to work with them. For a home, this means maximizing passive solar gain. By simply ensuring a building has proper solar orientation and using thermal mass like stone or water to capture heat during the day and release it at night, you can eliminate a massive chunk of your heating and cooling needs without needing a complex power system.
So the strategy is to reduce the demand first, rather than trying to find a one-for-one replacement for the electricity we use now. But at some point, we still need power for things like lighting, communication, or even small-scale processing. Decentralization seems to be the key here.
Decentralization is vital because a network of many small, independent energy systems is far more resilient than a single, vulnerable power grid. Permaculture encourages identifying the most abundant renewable resource in your specific area. If you're on a windy coast, small-scale wind turbines might be the answer. If you have a stream with a vertical drop, microhydro is incredibly efficient. But for most, it's the sun. The goal is to move beyond just solar panels on the roof and toward integrated systems. For example, using solar energy for direct water heating is far more efficient than converting sunlight to electricity and then using that electricity to heat water. Israel has actually mandated solar hot water systems for new homes since the 1950s, and today over 90% of their homes utilize them. That's a classic permaculture strategy. Use the highest quality energy for the most difficult tasks, and let the sun do the heavy lifting for the simple ones.
What about the industrial inputs on the farm side? You mentioned fertilizers earlier. If we lose the ability to produce cheap synthetic nitrogen because natural gas becomes too expensive or scarce, how does permaculture maintain yields? Critics often argue that organic or permaculture methods just can't feed the world because they aren't, quote, productive enough compared to the Green Revolution models.
The productivity argument is a bit of a sleight of hand. Industrial agriculture is highly productive per human hour of labor, but it's often less productive per acre than intensive polycultures when you account for the diversity of yields. In an energy descent future, we have to trade fossil fuel energy for design and information energy. To replace synthetic fertilizers, permaculture uses biological resources. Nitrogen-fixing plants like clover, alfalfa, or peas are grown in rotation or as guilds alongside food crops. These plants have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that literally pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil. We also use animals as tractors. Instead of a diesel machine tilling the soil and a factory-produced fertilizer, you might use chickens or pigs in a controlled way to clear land, eat pests, and naturally fertilize the ground with their manure. It's a closed-loop system where the waste of one element becomes the input for another.
That sounds more labor-intensive, though. If we're moving away from machines, doesn't that mean we all have to go back to being peasants? That's a hard sell for modern society.
It's certainly more human-intensive, but David Holmgren makes an important distinction. It doesn't have to be drudgery. Much of the labor in industrial farming is required to fix problems created by the industrial system itself, like spraying more chemicals to kill pests that only exist because of monocropping. Permaculture aims for small and slow solutions. By designing for self-regulation, the system becomes more efficient over time. Initially, yes, setting up a food forest or an integrated water system takes a lot of energy. But Holmgren suggests we should use our remaining fossil fuel wealth now to build these self-sustaining structures. Think of it like an investment. Using a bulldozer today to dig a pond or build a dam can provide gravity-fed water for the next 100 years with almost no additional energy. We're using the capital of fossil fuels to build the biological capital of a resilient landscape.
Let's talk about the transition for someone living in a city or suburb. Most people don't have 30 acres to build a dam. Holmgren's work on retro-suburbia addresses this. If the suburbs are, as some critics say, the greatest misallocation of resources in history, how do we actually retrofit them for energy descent?
The retro-suburbia strategy is about turning those sterile landscapes into productive ones. It starts with the behavioral field, changing how we live. This means things like sharing homes to reduce the per capita energy load, paying off debt to reduce the need for high-income and usually high-energy jobs, and rebuilding the household economy. Instead of every family having a lawnmower, a car, and a washing machine, you share resources with neighbors. Then there's the biological field. We should be tearing up lawns to plant fruit trees and vegetable gardens. Suburbs actually have a massive amount of underutilized space that could produce a significant portion of our fresh food, which reduces the energy needed for refrigerated transport. During the early 1990s in Cuba, after the collapse of the Soviet Union caused a sudden energy descent, urban gardens and permaculture techniques were crucial in preventing widespread famine. They proved that cities can be redesigned to be much more self-sufficient.
It seems like a recurring theme here is moving away from the efficiency of specialization toward the resilience of diversity. In the industrial model, a farm might only grow corn. In a permaculture model, it grows 50 different things. But doesn't that make the system harder to manage without a central command or a big machine?
It makes it more complex, but that complexity is what provides the stability. If a single pest or weird weather event hits a corn monoculture, the entire yield is lost. In a diverse permaculture system, if the tomatoes fail, the beans might thrive. It's about stacking functions. A single element should perform multiple roles. A hedgerow isn't just a fence, it's a windbreak, a habitat for beneficial insects that eat pests, a source of mulch, and maybe even a source of berries or fodder for animals. By integrating these functions, you reduce the need for external energy to perform those tasks separately. We have to shift from a linear mindset, where inputs go in and waste comes out, to a circular one, where nothing is wasted.
One of the most challenging aspects of this transition is water. Our current system relies on massive, energy-heavy infrastructure to move water from reservoirs to farms and homes. How does a permaculture design manage water in a future where those pumps might not be running reliably?
The mantra in permaculture is slow it, spread it, and sink it. Instead of letting rainwater hit the ground and run off into a storm drain, carrying topsoil and pollution with it, we design the landscape to capture it. On a farm, this often involves swales, which are trenches dug on the contour of the land. They catch the runoff and hold it, allowing it to slowly infiltrate the soil and recharge the groundwater. This creates a sponge in the landscape. For a home, it's about rainwater harvesting from roofs and graywater recycling. Every drop of water that enters a site should be used multiple times before it leaves. You might use it for washing, then filtered through a reed bed, then used to irrigate a fruit tree. Gravity is the only energy source required for a well-designed system like this. It's essentially about re-establishing the hydrological cycle at a local level.
If we scale this up, Are we looking at a future that's fundamentally more rural? If the energy for long-distance transport and industrial food processing disappears, the logic of megacities seems to falter.
A re-ruralization is likely inevitable in a true energy descent scenario. As the cost of transporting food and goods increases, the economic center of gravity shifts back toward the land. But it's not a return to the past, it's a post-industrial integration. We can still use what we've learned from systems science and ecology. We might see the growth of eco-villages or the transformation of existing small towns into bioregional hubs. The goal is to create human settlements that are deeply integrated with their local environment. It requires a cultural shift away from limitless growth toward dynamic stability. We have to accept feedback from the planet, which is another core permaculture principle. If the soil is degrading or the climate is changing, that's feedback that our current system is inappropriate and needs to stop.
It feels like permaculture is offering a very optimistic take on what many people see as a scary prospect. Most talk about the end of cheap energy involves collapse, but permaculture frames it as a prosperous descent. How do we keep that mindset when the challenges are so systemic?
The optimism comes from the fact that we already have the tools. Permaculture isn't waiting for a technological breakthrough. It's about applying principles we already understand to the resources we already have. It's also about fair share, the third ethic of permaculture. In an energy-abundant world, we focus on competition and accumulation. In an energy-constrained world, cooperation and sharing become the most rational economic strategies. When you start building these local networks, bartering with neighbors, sharing tools, growing community gardens, you realize that life can actually be higher quality, even with less stuff. You're moving from financial capital to social and living capital. The transition is about building that resilience now while we still have the luxury of choice.
The transition away from industrial dependence isn't just a technical challenge. It's a profound cultural reorganization. By applying the 12 principles of permaculture, from catching and storing energy to valuing the marginal, we can move from being passive consumers of a fragile global system to being active designers of a resilient local one. Whether it's retrofitting a suburban home or redesigning a farm's nutrient cycle, the practical steps involve working with nature's inherent logic rather than trying to overpower it with fossil fuels. The future might have less energy, but that doesn't mean it has to be less abundant. If this shift towards self-reliance resonates with you, consider sharing this perspective with someone who is looking for a way to build a more regenerative future.